The Marvel Cinematic Universe boasts an array of different genres within their universe to cater to anyone's needs. If you're not a fan of a World War II historical piece, then maybe a fantasy romance is more your thing. And that's how Marvel hooked an audience in Phase 1. Each film was so distinctly different visually and tonally that some people even forgot to this day that a film like The Incredible Hulk is in the MCU. And due to Marvel trying to get a separate fan base attached to each character, so that when the Avengers rolled round, you were guaranteed to already be a fan of one of the characters, or at the very least be familiar with them. Phase 2 was full of sequels that varied in quality, depending on the director, but the only original characters introduced were the Guardians of the Galaxy and Ant-Man. Guardians of the Galaxy became an overnight hit, due to a very funny script and likeable characters. However, when you strip these characters to their core, I believe the reason audiences liked them is because they were essentially the same characters from the Avengers, turned up to 11. Marvel had begun reusing ideas in order to make a property that was completely unknown more bankable due to brand awareness and the repetition of character traits that audiences already liked. But the audiences noticed this. Although Guardians of the Galaxy is marketed as a sci-fi comedy, tonally it matched every other Marvel film before it, and visually it was just as flat and colourless, so that it would fit in with the rest of the universe. And so, it seemed like a retread of Avengers 1 on a smaller scale with a new coat of paint. Then we get to Ant-Man. Something Marvel has always prioritised is their director's vision. Guardians of the Galaxy was saved by James Gunn. Jon Favreau gave us Robert Downey Jr. and Shane Black gave us Ben Kingsley in a bathrobe. Edgar Wright was going to give us a unique and stylish take on Ant-Man, which was pitched just after Shaun of the Dead released. It became stuck in development hell, and by the time it was ready, the MCU had already moved away from the distinct and creatively varied movies, and created movies that looked the same, felt the same, and had the same audience impressions. Edgar Wright was quietly let go, and so I find Ant-Man one of the most interesting of the MCU, because you can see where the film has been changed and toned down to fit the rest of the Marvel movies at that time. What we got was a retelling of Iron Man, right down to the character's arc, the message, and the story structure, not to mention the near-identical villain in almost every way. And yet the film being marketed as a heist movie and the great cast is what got its audience. But the potential was never reached. The idea of an Ant-Man heist film directed by Edgar Wright sounds phenomenal, and what we got was bland and forgettable, with a yes-man director brought in to finish the job and take the credit. Not a bad gig. I believe this is where the downfall truly began. I understand I'm neglecting to mention the likes of Captain America the Winter Soldier or even the first Iron Man, which are largely regarded as fantastic movies that stick out from the MCU and work as great movies on their own. However, these are the exceptions, as there will always be, in which a director's vision is fully realised with a fantastic tone that fits the MCU style perfectly and results in a great piece of cinema. I'd like to group these next few films together, that being Doctor Strange, Black Panther and Captain Marvel, and I'm sure just listing these films will already allow you to see the similarities. These are the only standalone first outings for a character in Phase 3, aside from Spider-Man Homecoming that will get its own section. First, let's look at the concept of each film. Doctor Strange is a psychedelic fantasy about magicians operating all over the world, boasting Inception-like visuals and uses of different magic spells. So why did this film turn out to be a carbon copy of Iron Man, with the same arc as both Tony Stark and Scott Lang being given to Stephen Strange, with the exact same villain conceptually as Ant-Man and the visuals that make Inception look tame in comparison, yet none of them feel anywhere near as impactful? I believe Marvel realised with Ant-Man they didn't need a director's vision in order to make a profit. The brand had almost created immunity by simply selling the audience on the concept and never delivering. Doctor Strange 2 has been announced as a horror, however I'm betting now it'll be as much a horror as The Trench from Aquaman. The addition of Scarlet Witch is also the same selling point used for Thor Ragnarok, which acts as another form of Marvel stealing ideas from themselves in order to attract an audience. This one is difficult to define. I'm tempted to call it a sci-fi concept mixed with a BBC documentary. However, let's be honest, the selling point is the African traditions and all-black cast, which had a positive impact on the black community. However, the actual film copies elements from, guess what, the first Iron Man. Every film listed as being compared to Iron Man all seem to use the villain being a rogue individual that went against the beliefs of a company or force. Obadiah Stane goes against Stark Industries and builds another Iron Man. Yellow Jacket goes against Pym Technologies and builds a Yellow Ant-Man. Caecilius goes against the Ancient One and gains evil magic, or whatever the eye thing was meant to be. And Killmonger goes against Wakanda and gains another Black Panther suit. It's just plain lazy on the behalf of the writers, and I believe the writers didn't get enough time to think about the plots of their stories. So instead, we're forced to come up with a few creative ideas and then copy and paste other elements from previous movies. Imagine if The Dark Knight featured Harvey Dent gaining another bat suit after the explosion and fought Batman in a white version of the suit as a literal white knight. That is how Marvel would have ended that movie, and it's just a very basic, forgettable story beat. Black Panther decides to tell two stories in the span of one movie, and it feels more fitting as a two-parter. Stop the film when Claw gets killed and leave that as a cliffhanger. Then the next day, watch the rest of the film and it feels like you've missed nothing. It's a very odd structure that is attempting to move around the way the Marvel formula worked, by changing the rate at which the plot is told. And this makes the movie ultimately have a very dragging middle act. Captain Marvel is the best example of the Marvel formula not working. Because even if you hate Black Panther and Doctor Strange, you will find the characters good elsewhere. Doctor Strange is fantastic in Infinity War, and Black Panther is part of the best chase scene in the MCU. There, I said it. The films may be weak, in my humble opinion, but the characters are always the focus for Marvel Studios, and that's why these films are so successful. It's also what saved Venom. Despite Ant-Man, Doctor Strange and Iron Man going through the same arc, they all act incredibly different, and it's the only thing the MCU has in these solo films to create some variety. Captain Marvel is the first Marvel film to have a bad lead character. Not actress, character. Captain Marvel tries something different from the Marvel formula and utterly fails. It tells the story out of order, removes a character arc for the main character, and has no genre or concept. What is Captain Marvel about? What is the message? Why should I care? And oh look, the villain is a green version of the hero, but with a weird gravity gun that literally never poses a threat. I would describe it as a film desperate to actually be different, to change the formula of Marvel movies, and, like it or not, that is something I encourage. At its core, Captain Marvel is technically a period piece, like Captain America 1, and mixes the wacky space hijinks of Guardians of the Galaxy, without being anywhere near as varied as either. I haven't been mentioning the directors for these three movies, and it's because they seem to have very little influence on the final product. Scott Derrickson gave us Sinister, which I personally like, and is known for horror and sci-fi, which makes him a pretty great pick. However, there's nothing about the direction of Doctor Strange, aside from a few shots, that make it look any different to Thor 2. Black Panther is a worse offender, since it's directed by Ryan Coogler, who masterfully brought us Creed, which included an impressive one-take fight scene that seems to be his new trademark, since another shows up here hilariously poorly. Apart from one cool shot as Killmonger approaches the throne, I see literally nothing that stands out, and Captain Marvel has nothing worth talking about whatsoever in terms of direction. So moving on. I'm once again going to mention that there are exceptions, and I'm picking the worst case scenarios for the lack of variety. In Phase 3 we had Guardians of the Galaxy 2 and Thor Ragnarok. They were incredibly director focused. Guardians 2 turned the characters from Avengers knockoffs into three-dimensional characters. whereas Ragnarok brings a different comedic style and energy that truly makes it feel different from every other Marvel film before it. But once again, that is 2 examples that I would truly call great. Spider-Man Homecoming gets its own section because it's the only example of Marvel creating a movie in collaboration with another company, except for The Incredible Hulk in 2008. Sony has a very distinct style to their movie, typically featuring more product placement than characters, and also a focus on doing whatever it takes to make money. However, they also have lots of creative control over their properties, so Spider-Man Homecoming is an interesting example because it truly is a compromise. The smaller scale seems to be Kevin Feige's idea, however the inclusion of Iron Man and a truly great villain in the form of Vulture seems to actually be from Sony's part. And it's why I was incredibly excited for Far From Home, since these Spider-Man films always seem to be a step ahead of this typical Marvel filler. They have better looking effects, better scripts, and a nice colour palette, something the MCU could use more of. The inclusion of Sony seems to give Marvel a kick up the backside to actually make something that stood out from the other movies, in order to make Sony the most money and attention, and has somewhat worked. I'd definitely say it's the best solo film since Guardians of the Galaxy, and seems to start the trend of including multiple Avengers in each film to maximise ticket sales. This is something I mentioned at the beginning, that Marvel used their solo films in Phase 1 to make you like each character, then had the Avengers bring in every audience for those movies altogether, and now this appears to be the case for every Marvel movie featuring multiple Avengers, including Winter Soldier, Ant-Man, Civil War, Homecoming, Thor Ragnarok, and the upcoming Doctor Strange 2. So where does this leave us for Phase 4? I have no doubt Black Widow will have nothing of interest, with no additional Avengers to draw an audience in, and no important plot points to learn. It's a shame that we can already predict this movie won't have any good camera work or visual style, but will probably have a good set of characters, and I assume another Iron Man 1 style villain that is a member of the Black Widow program gone rogue. Eternals would be a mix of Guardians of the Galaxy but without the direction or humour that made it great, and will probably be similar to Captain Marvel in tone, especially with Angelina Jolie as the lead. Shang-Chi, you may as well copy and paste my thoughts on Black Widow. Doctor Strange 2 could be interesting if it's rated 15 and has actual horror involved, but I highly doubt it being a Disney film. And finally, Thor 4 has Taika Waititi at the helm. So, I hope it does for Thor what Guardians 2 did for the Guardians of the Galaxy, and it's the only film I feel will be memorable in the entire phase, Disney Plus included. Oh, and Blade will be watered down, and nowhere near as good as Wesley Snipes' version, but Mahershala Ali will kill it, and I'll be curious to see if he fits in well with the other Avengers. There are movies in the MCU that do showcase the variety and true potential a universe like this can have. While I've only highlighted the formulaic Marvel movies, there are fantastic movies in this universe that I will highlight individually in their own videos, because it's important to focus on the movies that show the weak points also. The ones that show the limitations of a shared universe. The ideas and visions of Phase 1 have been slowly filtered out, and now these creative takes are one in a dime a dozen, and it causes these movies to become lost in the mix. The MCU can make a certain calibre of films depending on the director, but the real tragedy is that despite a director's ambition, they could not make a film like Logan, like the Dark Knight trilogy, and quite literally, like an Edgar Wright directed Ant-Man. But they did make a film like The Avengers, Infinity War and Endgame, that took even the worst of these films and made it all worth something. A huge collaboration that brought audiences to tears, and for a moment, movies like Captain Marvel were a bad dream.